So here you see a map of the invasion of Rome. And one thing I want you to remember is the word Goth. Here you see Visigoth. Here you see Ostrogoths. So these are some of the tribes that invade Rome and divide the Roman Empire into many different kingdoms. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, the Roman Empire was split up. Okay, in the Renaissance, people began to use this term Goth as in a negative connotation, like barbarian, very backwards, kind of dark. Okay, and in the Renaissance, remember they wanted to recreate the classical period, and that included architecture, sculpture, arts. Okay, so anything that has the word Goth in it is seen as negative. In the 1000s to 1100s, the people of Europe, and this started in France, developed this type of architecture called Gothic architecture. Gothic architecture. And Gothic architecture, they didn't call it Gothic architecture when it was developed. This is the term that comes later. This is a term that is given to this type of architecture during the Renaissance. Okay, they see it as kind of like brute, kind of wild, kind of too much. And I disagree with the people of the Renaissance. I think Gothic architecture is actually quite quite beautiful. It's very impressive. It's really amazing. And there are several characteristics of Gothic architecture, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them right now. Gothic architecture is the churches are primarily very kind of, I don't want to say skinny, but they look skinny because they're really tall. Okay, so they're pretty high. But there's other buildings that are high. That doesn't mean that they're all Gothic Gothic churches. Here is an example of a Gothic church. The number one thing that you should look at to define a Gothic church or Gothic architecture is these arches. They are not rounded arches. They are kind of rounded, but then there's a dot here, like a point. So they are pointed arches. Another telltale sign of Gothic architecture is the use of windows. Gothic churches have a lot of windows. You can't see that many in this one, but they're probably on the side, maybe. This is inside a Gothic church. A lot of windows, a lot of light. It kind of reaches towards the heavens, give it a heavenly look. This is stained glass window, and what they had was mostly images of the Bible. Most people at this time can't read, so they learn through these visuals. Here's some more. Um, when I see this, I'm just in awe that of these churches. These churches sometimes it will take over 100 years to build, so you can start working on a church, and you wouldn't. You could work on it throughout your life, and it still wouldn't be finished by the time you die. Here are some more examples. Here's another one. See the pointed arches here, very high, um, very high, thin walls. And one way that they got around making such thin walls was because they developed these things called flying buttresses. These things, I'll show you in a second. Another one, flying buttresses. This wall is supporting the rest of the building. Let me see. There's some real good examples. Flying buttresses. Oh no. Here's a flying buttress. So these are holding up the wall. You really can't see them well here because it only shows part of it. Let me see if I can find a building. Here we go. This is a better one. So this building is being held up by this space right here. Again, this is called Gothic architecture, developed during the 1000s to 1100s, 1200s in France primarily, but eventually it split into different parts of Europe. And it's very different than the architecture of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had a lot of columns, had a lot of domes. Gothic architecture does not have domes, and I will talk about what domes are in another lesson. But here is the main part of the church. Here is the flying buttress right here, flying buttress, and here are the pointed arches. As you can see, there's no dome. A dome is like a semicircle. That is something that the Romans did, that the people of the Renaissance wanted to copy and recreate. Let me show you a Renaissance architecture, and we'll see some differences between the Renaissance architecture and the medieval architecture. So this is Renaissance architecture. Here you have some columns, and then you have the big dome. The dome is copied from ancient Rome. If you look at Renaissance architecture, you're gonna have a really hard time knowing if it's Renaissance or classical Roman, because they are so similar. Again, here's another Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. This church was actually created towards the end of the Middle Ages, but the dome is not created until much later in the Renaissance period. So the things that I want you to get out of this is Gothic architecture is created during the late medieval period in France. Um, it is not called Gothic architecture at that time. It is a name given to the architecture later during the Renaissance, and it's kind of like an insult. It's very Gothic. It's very like it's an insult because they saw Goths as being kind of like the ones that destroyed Rome, the barbarians that destroyed Rome. So they consider this type of architecture very very barbarian. Gothic, but I think that it's an amazing type of architecture. You might disagree with me, and that's okay, um, because we all have different opinions. And here's another example of the flying buttresses. Their purpose, I think, their purposes are to decorate, but also to make the church stronger and to make the church be able to reach up higher. Um, and here's another one. This one actually very recently. This one was burned about a year ago, and it's in the process of being not rebuilt, but I'm not sure what the word is, but just being fixed. Let's see if I can find some other ones. Oh yeah, Gothic architecture also had a lot of these little statues called kind of like gargoyles. It's to almost to intimidate people or to show people what lay ahead in the afterlife if they didn't go to the church, if they didn't listen to the Catholic Church. Gargoyles are really cool. Um, it's kind of like this is what awaits you. It's a reminder that what you do here on earth is you're gonna pay for it one way or the other when you go to heaven. If you've seen the movie The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it's set in Paris and it's set in a Gothic church. Again, tomorrow I'll be focusing on Gothic versus Renaissance. Today I only talked about Renaissance a little bit, not a lot. But tomorrow we'll be focusing more on what makes Gothic and Renaissance. What are the major differences? Again, the big difference here is flying buttresses. Gothic is medieval. Renaissance it's obviously later, and it has styles that are borrowed heavily from the classical period, both Greece and Rome. Have fun.